Without further ado, I'd like to invite the first affirmative speaker to begin the debate.
Everyone hear me? All good? Cool.
Yes, we can hear you.
Starting now. We on the firmly think that Palestine's situation is deteriorating over time and that statehood is impossible, and that over time, the chances of any kind of agreement that ensures civil rights for Palestinian people is getting worse and worse. We think that what's best for the region and for the Palestinian people is to use the power and leverage that they have right now to get the best resolution possible by rather than seeking the impossible goal of statehood, instead seeking protections and rights within the Israeli state. So first, just on a few points of context. First important point of context is that we think that Israeli expansionism is likely to continue to escalate. Like, the first thing to note here is that Israeli expansionism has occurred under multiple governments. This isn't something that's like temporary, that's going to go away. This has been happening for decades because it's central to what the Israeli state is based on. Because Israel sees itself as being under attack. It's surrounded by Arab states on all sides. It sees its actions as defensive and is protecting itself from a region that it thinks is aiming to destroy it. It sees the West Bank and Gaza as a threat. It sees them as a place from which you can launch missiles. It sees them as a place from which you can launch an invasion of Israel. And so its actions are fundamentally based on a notion of defending itself against this perceived threat. And so we think that means that Israel's expansion is likely to continue to escalate over time, and Israel is incredibly unlikely to accept anything resembling a Palestinian state because it sees that as such a threat. The second important bit of context is just about like more broadly what's going on in the world. So firstly, we think that it's really unlikely that the international community will ever be able to put any significant pressure on Israel, because this Israeli expansionism, the expansion into Palestinian areas, has consistently occurred despite international pressure. No one has managed to find a way to convince Israel to stop trying to expand. We don't think it's very likely that that's going to happen in the future. The second important point of context is that like Palestine's allies are incredibly unreliable at the moment. All nations have been hit by an increasing desire to focus on what's going on at home, kind of apathy with the general situation in the Middle East, the coronavirus pandemic. So all of Palestine's allies are likely to be incredibly unreliable, and there's little protection for Palestine going into the future. There's just this general sense that like no one can be bothered anymore worrying about what's going on there. It's been happening for decades. Like, we can't get involved in protecting Palestine too heavily. But the strongest actor, who is probably still the most reliable, is that the US will never support Palestinian statehood because of those domestic political pressures that mean that the US will always veto anything resembling a Palestinian state. The third important point of context is that like other Arab states have kind of accepted over the last few decades that Israel is not a threat to them, and they're losing interest in supporting Palestine. So the surrounding Arab states have decided, look, we can live with like an Israeli state there who isn't trying to attack us. So the support for Palestine is decreasing over time. Israeli expansion is increasing, and Palestine is soon to be left with very, very little protection. So what does that mean for the probability of statehood? It means that the probability of statehood is like next to none. We think there are two possible mechanisms by which a state can achieve statehood. Firstly, by force. We think this is incredibly unlikely. As we said, Palestine's losing a lot of its allies and is just like weaker in general in kind of military terms to Israel. So it's very unlikely that Palestine will be able to kind of scare Israel into giving it statehood. And the other way is goodwill, or just like Israel granting them statehood, potentially influenced by international pressure. As we said, other nations are becoming increasingly unreliable, increasingly reluctant to get involved in this issue, increasingly apathetic. And we also think that like Israel's territory and Israel's existence is fundamental to what that state is based on. And so it's incredibly unlikely that Israel will ever allow Palestine to have land just through goodwill. So after that point, we think the probability of statehood is incredibly minimal. So why are civil rights more likely? The first reason is that they don't require land. So land is really important to what Israel is based on. Israel was founded as the homeland for the Jewish people. The land on which Israel stands is what the state fundamentally cares about. And by giving civil rights, that doesn't require Israel to give up any of that land. So we think that makes it much more likely. The second reason is that based on that same principle, it's not a zero-sum game. So Israel will never give up statehood because that requires it to give up something that it has. Giving up civil rights, like it doesn't mean that Israel has to lose anything. So we think it's much more likely that Israel's willing to accept that. And finally, like Israel isn't evil. Israel doesn't want all of the Palestinians to die. There's a fundamental desire to end this conflict. Both sides are getting worn out by the protracted stalemate, by the continual bombings. Neither side wants to live in a country racked by war. And so we think Israel is quite likely to want to do this because they want to end this conflict and because they're not evil enough to just want Palestinians to die over time. So what do these civil rights look like and why are they so important? We think it looks like the cessation of bombing. It looks like an agreement over the ownership of Jerusalem and freedom of religion to be given to Palestinians. We think it looks like legal protections within an Israeli state. We think this essentially looks like Palestinians becoming citizens of Israel and using all of the leverage they have. Their waning support by their Arab neighbors, using the leverage that they have in the international community, which, as we said, is decreasing over time, but is still there, using that leverage that they have right now to get an agreement that protects all of these rights, getting Israel to enshrine in constitutions and in legislation that they will give rights to Palestinians. We think this looks like Palestinians being able to own their own homes without fear of those homes being taken away by Israeli expansion. We think it looks like them being able to go to school without threats of bombing. We think this is incredibly beneficial to Palestinians. And we think even if there was any chance of statehood, it's not going to happen in the short term. And in the short term, this is going to be incredibly harmful, even though we think a state is never going to rise anyway. And also note that this isn't an act of debate. So even if Palestinians were slightly worse off, and we don't think they are, we think they are massively better off by getting these civil rights. Even if Palestinians were worse off, we still think that we win because we're resolving this massive point of tension in the world. We think that when you resolve this protracted conflict, when you resolve a lot of these problems in the Middle East, that helps to diffuse the situation in regions like Yemen. It helps to protect other states in the region, and we think it could also liberalize Israel and stop this from being a side where both sides have this incentive to continually escalate to just existing like a normal state. We think that there are plenty of examples where states with multiple religious or ethnic groups have existed perfectly peacefully. We think the problem with Israel and Palestine isn't the coexistence of two different groups. It's the fact that both of them want something that they can't both have. And that's incentivizing both nations to become increasingly militaristic and increasingly violent. We think if Israel gives civil rights to Palestinians, that massively protects both sides, both from violence and from just the general increasing militarization of the region. We think this could resolve other flashpoints in the region, such as the problems in Yemen, and it could also liberalize Israel and liberalize the broader region in order to ensure both sides have the rights they need and have greater civil rights, including protection from things like bombings. In the end, we think this is Palestine's only option to get any protections as Israeli expansion continues. We are very proud to propose.
Thank you to the first affirmative speaker for that speech. I'd now like to invite the first negative speaker to deliver their speech.
Am I audible? Hi.
Yes, you are.
Okay. When they said it is hard to gain international support because of the coronavirus, the intuition that I got is why do we need to abandon this right now? Because the thing is that South Affirmative are going to abandon the biggest legitimacy, which is to say the negotiation card, which will allow us to have, for example, equitable two-state solution or better version of civilized, acquiring civil rights, which South Affirmative want to do. I don't get any clue why giving up this legitimate card will suddenly lead to better outcome that they have talked about. But more importantly, they somewhat assume that Israel Israel is so strong, but I don't think it is something which will continue forever for two reasons. One, like Israel is now currently criticized for like invading Yemen, but two, they're heavily dependent on oil, which means that their prominence is not something sustainable forever. I don't understand why it is particularly now in this moment that we need to give up this legitimacy, this negotiation card, which drives the biggest legitimacy from our side of the house. I have two arguments to talk about. Number one, why do we think international support is something is going to benefit our side? But secondly, why do I think civil movement won't function under their side of the house? Before that set up, firstly, what is a clarification of what Israel wants? What Israel wants is the three things but however, they can't have all of three of them. So what is that? Number one, control of territory between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. But two, claims to be a legitimate democracy. But three, majority of Jewish voting base. However, the reason why they cannot have that is because if you incorporate the territory and citizenry, you have a majority Arab population and must disenfranchise those individuals. And we think that is something that is the problem that we need to understand under their side of the house. Now, firstly, onto the struggle of the statehood. The first thing to note here is that we think the claim that the Palestinians having right now is perfectly legitimate. One, because they have been colonized and continue to be colonized, as we see in the status quo. But the two, the world in which they accede to Israel is just, in the current universe, like United Nations is currently now like understanding this legitimacy more and more. That is why United Nations in and of itself actually recognize the statehood of Israel, Palestine. But secondly, the international society views this problem as a global issue, and we think this is important. Number one, because it involves statehood. Note that in the current society, the reason why like people pay less attention to the well-being of Syrian refugees, for example, in Syria, is because it's regarded as a domestic issue. However, if we make it in between state conflict, it's going to be an issue within United Nations, which allows many states to actually opt into this discussion. And we think that is why people regard this as a global issue. While if we just make it a like well-being of the people in a domestic issue, it's like people won't pay attention to it. But secondly, it prevents like global intervention or global pressuring to happen in the first place, because again, it will be viewed as a domestic issue under their side of the house. As long as keeping to be a global issue, that is the moment in which the international society can actually recognize it and she can step into it. But the second piece is the third piece that we need to talk about is how pressure to stop colonizing Palestine is something likely to happen. So if you look at the status quo, what is happening is number one, the negotiation between the Islamic government. But two, we can have a diplomatic sanction or soft pressure against Israel government. Or thirdly, we can have this embargo under our side of the house. They have what affirmative have offered to you today is that how US won't support or how coronavirus does exist, but doesn't deal with the fact that already in the status quo, we are taking action to it. The impact, therefore, the impact that we need to understand here then is that number one, because it leads to more potential future of an equitable two-state solution, which is, by the way, not our burden to win, which is our best case anyways, but because it's going to lead to a potential future of having an equitable two-state solution, we think it's something good. But secondly, more importantly, even if it does not happen, the point at which Israel colonizes Palestine out of existence is one which the international community continues to care about underside. We think it is important that the international community cares about which side affirmative never gets to have. The reason why it is important is because one, international society recognizes it, but two, the Palestinians never gave up their right to statehood, which means that we can have better discussion or negotiation compared to their side of the house. Which nicely leads to the final part. So even if like Israel are to win against Palestine, one, we think we can have a better path to the civil right because we have more negotiation chip. Because underside of affirmative, they are going to now recognize that there are no more legitimacy as a Palestine state, but trying to seek for more help to Israeli government. This means that there are no more legitimate reason or logic as to why Palestinian people can claim more suffrage or better protection or quality of life under the Israel government. I don't think that is something good under their side of the house. Now, moving on to the second argument, which directly clashes with their argument. Is it possible to have this, better civil rights movement on the side of the affirmative. Note here that affirmative side just asserted that asking for like Israel government will suddenly make a good future, but I don't think there are any clear mechanisms as to what extent their right will be endured and what is the incentive structure behind Israel to suddenly accept that offer in the first place, right? Which we tell you from our side that this negotiation chip, which is a legitimate card, is the biggest pressure in which we can enact change under our side of the house. The first piece I want to deal with is this exclusivity. As I said, I don't think asking for a better quality of life of the people there is something exclusive in the first place, but two, we think going for hardline is something which allows more legitimate, going for legitimate hardline is something allows a Palestinian to have better condition at the end of the day compared to their side. The logic is very simple. Give an inch till they take the mile. We think if you start from a higher end, I think the likelihood of you getting something better is comparatively higher compared to their side, because there's no incentive for Israel government to suddenly, concede to everything and give whatever that these people actually want. But nextly, so the here that we need to emphasize here is that you are giving up the biggest negotiation chip underside affirmative. Number one is to say this legitimacy, but two is this international support that we have talked about. But three, that the threat that Israel government are feeling right now, which is to say that they are going to lose their territory. We think these three pressures is something unique to push for better change under our side. But second, the reason why our side is better is because we can consistently lobby while the opposite is going to happen underside of affirmative. What do I mean by that? So what is happening right now is that so right now we have this massive lobbying power against Israeli government because we are particularly in the same level, but as opposed to that underside affirmative, you're going to lose this capital, and under their side the Israel individual, the Palestine individual will be under the control of Israeli government, which means that this Palestine individual will be deprived of their capital to lobby against that government, or also they're going to be like fixed under this oppression of Israeli government. But the third piece that we need to understand is that the institution of Israel is based on this Jewish establishment, and it is particularly hard to fight against it under their side of the house. But the final piece of analysis onto this argument, which is the fourth point, is about the trilemma that Israel actually faces right now. As I said in the beginning, Israel is suffering because of this trilemma that they want to have democracy, but also they want to have this Arab majority within their side of the house. That is why the likely outcome under their side is one, push Palestine to, for example, Jordan or those places and just marginalize them. But two, in order to limit the capacities for Palestine individual to practice their right within Israel, they're likely to, for example, deprive their shelter, deprive their education under their side, because that is in the best interest of Israel government to do. But thirdly, they're more likely to deprive they're going to more likely to lock a Palestine individual into the particular area of the Israel. That is why we don't think giving up the biggest legitimate trump to fight against Israel is a smart idea to do right now. But more importantly, even if we try to beg for some support, Israel have no incentive to listen to it, but just end up locking them. For all that reason, I don't think affirmative will make the world any better. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you to the first negative speaker for that speech. I'd now like to invite the second affirmative speaker.
Okay. There is only one capital city that you can bomb in the world from Gaza or the West Bank, and that capital city is Jerusalem. And I think that means of all the countries in the world, the one that cares the most about possession of the West Bank is Israel, the one that owns Jerusalem. And we tell you that is the reason as to why Israel will never stop its expansionary efforts in the West Bank. But importantly, right, this also explains why other Arab nations are totally fine with just giving them the West Bank, because they see that as soon as Israel possesses the West Bank, they're fine. because their incentive to control it is defensive. It is not aggression towards other Arab nations, and so other Arab nations don't give a shit about supporting Palestine. So, two questions in the speech. Firstly on statehood, secondly on rights. Firstly on statehood. What do they say? The first thing that they say is, you're giving up a position of power because right now you're both equal as states, and if you no longer make the claim to statehood, you're giving up some claim to power, right? Like, if Australia asks the US to do something really nice to them, we're both states, but we are not on the same playing ground. You have to prove this. Just because you're both states does not mean your power is equal. And we tell you that the power derives from two sources: A, goodwill, or B, military power. And at the point at which Israel has so much more military power than Palestine, because it is able to continue its existence in things like the Arab-Israeli war, in things like the Six-Day War, we tell you that it's likely the balance of power is that of Israel being much, much stronger. And importantly, right, I don't think they're ever able to clearly give a mechanism as to how things are going to change from status quo, because we point to the fact that the status quo has existed for the past 50 or so, greater than 50 years, and they have to isolate why now is the tipping point. Okay, and what is their analysis? The first thing they say is oil, right? Like, Israel does not own much oil. I'm going to assert this. And the systematic justification I'm going to give is that, like, Israel is probably a really small country. Everyone knows that. And it's probably much smaller than all the Arab countries. And it's unlikely that all the Arab countries will just give Israel the most oil-rich thing. So Israel does not give a shit about oil. Israel, its strength is not increasing or changing as oil prices fluctuate. The second thing they say is they're becoming delegitimized in Yemen or some shit like that, right? Like, Israel has nothing to do with Yemen. That is a purely Arab conflict. Okay, the third thing they say is, their incentive, they give us these three nice incentives of Israel, right? Our response to this is, no, we told you the incentives of Israel in the beginning, that is defensive, and we gave you the geopolitical justification. Please don't just assert certain incentives, please give us justifications as to why that is the case. Third part of statehood, on Palestinian allies. We told you, as I flagged in my introduction, the Arabs are not threatened, therefore they're unlikely to change meaningfully. What does this all mean, right? I think that at the end of the day, this just proves that Israel, the status quo, is unlikely to be radically changed at this current moment. That is to say, in the same way that Palestine is not being able to assert itself meaningfully and just slowly losing, that is going to be the situation that continues onwards. Then they are like statehood. Then they're like coronavirus, and because this is the one piece of individual analysis unique to the current times, right? And they just say coronavirus means that Palestine is very strong. And we tell you that the exact opposite thing is likely to happen, because coronavirus is a global threat. That is to say, Israel is threatened by it, yes, but so is Palestine, and so is every other single country in the world, right? And altruism is only the privilege of those that are already secure in their own security, in their own safety, and in their own economic position. We tell you that since coronavirus threatens all people, this means that all other countries are going to be self-protective. That is to say, they're going to want to stabilize the economy under threat of coronavirus. But importantly, Israel does not change under the coronavirus threat because it is still an existential, like the Palestinian threat is still an existential threat in the same way coronavirus is. So they're likely to put huge amounts of resources to both threats. Like, maybe there's some minor diminishing, but this is less than the diminishing that you're going to see comparatively to the international actors. That's why coronavirus is an insufficient analysis. So I think at the end of that, statehood is exceedingly unlikely. So ought you weigh the rights point? The first thing we say is, please don't underestimate the ability to not get bombed every single day of your life. The ability to build a house and know that that house is not going to be annexed within the next 5 to 10 years because Israel is going to do something loose. The ability to guarantee people basic rights and protections is extremely important. But then they say, you can't forget these rights will exist forever, right? And here's the analysis as to why we're going to give you, as to why those rights are likely to continue to exist. Because right now, both left and right within the Israeli electoral system agree on self-protection, agree on the preservation of Israel, which means both sides agree that you ought to annex Gaza and the West Bank. That's why how Netanyahu brings about his strongman image, right? But by no longer posing an existential threat, you're much more likely to align yourself with the left movement within Israel, let us say the blue and white, which are focused on the protection of the underprivileged, which are focused on ideas, Marxist ideas of protecting workers or those who are particularly vulnerable, right? And at the point at which they no longer have a disincentive to support these Palestinian vulnerable people, it is likely that their ideology will compel them to try and secure Palestinians more and more rights, because it supports a basic tenet of their political establishment and the political party. And this is a means by which, instead of 0 people campaigning you for the electoral system right now, the left wing is likely to campaign you. But even we tell you that a likely depiction of this is the guaranteeing of citizenship. This means you now have a voice because you are now allowed to vote, which means you can influence the Israeli actions towards the Palestinian people in an extremely direct way. There's an electoral incentive by which to treat the Palestinian people well. So what else do they tell you? They say like, how can't you guarantee that Israelis won't just like torture them or something, right? Like, we tell you that the likely characterization of the people of Israel, they don't get off on torturing Palestinians, right? So we think they are likely imbued with the same human dignity and respect for other people that they do. And yes, they are vulnerable to things like fear of their self and they're wanting to protect their homes and families, which is how they currently justify Palestinian aggression. But I think if absent of that, removed of that, it is likely that these people would be a voice and campaigning for those to the Palestinians themselves. The final piece of analysis I'm going to give you here is to say that this is likely to defuse the region in an exceedingly unstable and fragile period in time. Because we are not claiming that we're going to remove Netanyahu or diffuse Yemen, right? But what we tell you is that right now the world is at a flashpoint, right? Coronavirus is existing, Yemen is a problem, Syria is a problem, Taliban is a problem. There's a huge degree of uncertainty, and any single one of these could trigger a flashpoint, which could spill over into the fact. What we tell you is that diffusing this particular situation removes one of those flashpoints, but also suggests that it is okay to remove these flashpoints and in order for mutual protection. That is to say, yes, maybe it is not ideal for either side, but because we acknowledge that coronavirus is a huge problem, because strongmanism is likely to be such you're likely to get less things like strongmanism because it relies on the protection and preying on people's fear and offering them certainty. I think a world in which this occurs, you'll likely see a diminishing of strongmanism, diminishing of fear, and a greater stability in one of the most fought parts of the world since in the past 40 years. So happy to propose.
Thank you to the second affirmative speaker for that speech. I now invite the second negative speaker.
Side affirmative woefully misunderstands their burden in this debate, because we never had to show you why the two-state solution was going to happen now, and we never needed to show you why the status quo was going to change now. All we had to show was that their policy would lead to irreparable harms to the most vulnerable actors in this case, and that is something that we did consistently at Taqwa, which remained mostly unresponded to regarding the incentives of the Israeli state. Because although it was true Israel wanted to control the land between and inclusive the West Bank and the Mediterranean Sea, it was also true that they cared about other things, which meant that the way in which they would do that would be actively pernicious to the very people who you were trying to claim benefits for. I'm going to speak about 3 things in this speech. Firstly and briefly, I'm going to speak on the two-state solution and colonialism. Then I'm going to speak about the genesis of international support and how you actually get that as a changing mechanism on both sides. And then I'm going to talk to you about civil rights. Okay, firstly on the two-state solution. The two-state solution in colonialism. So this is just like a brief principle here, is to say that we think it's principally unjust to support people acceding to colonialism because of the ongoing cultural harms, the ongoing trauma which you inflict on that group of people culturally. We think that's only magnified by the types of disproportionate civil rights which Arab citizens currently face in Israel, and which you are going to probably see perpetuated for future Palestinians. But also, we just stand behind the established sovereignty of we stand the established sovereignty of people and their right to continue advocating for that, especially when it coincides with the best case advocacy for them. Also, in terms of the two-state solution being impossible, they gave you two reasons for that. They were like, one, America. Note that Joe Biden, who's predicted to win the next election, stands for a two-state solution. And two, they were like, Israel faces is existential threat from Palestinians. We thought that was probably true, but that Israel also faced different types of existential threats from Palestinian, including the potential of having a majority Arab voting base within their territory, which is something that if you incorporated all of the Arabs in Palestine right now would be the case, which is obviously like incredibly like a huge harm for their ability to like continue perpetuating their standard policies or even having like Jewish majority parties in power, which is why they were never going to provide those rights in the way in which they want to claim. Okay, secondly, now on this idea of the genesis of international support. So what we got here was this claim that international support for Palestine is declining, and that's why you had to act now. A few responses to this, because I think if you're going to talk about why something is declining, you need to understand where it comes from in the first instance, and this neatly clashes with the stuff that they brought about Arab states viewing Israel as being defensive. We didn't think that was actually the genealogy of the support for Palestine at all, because it was still quite recent history in which those wars that they want to talk about had happened. And it was still quite recent history in which the active colonization of another post-Ottoman state happened right side by side. We noticed, literally the instance was you had all of these states surrounding Palestine fighting against Israel in a very bloody war, one in which Israel showed dominance. We think that's actually aggressive rather than defensive, and that's quite intuitive and clashes against one of their very few mechanisms there. But that also, insofar as they viewed the ability of Israel to take away the legitimacy of Palestine as a potential threat to their sovereignty into the future, that's where that support came from. The next, what we told you from Taqwa, which was very under-responded to, was that the fact that it was an issue between international groups put this firmly in the jurisdiction of international law, which didn't matter necessarily for any specific judicial outcome per se, but rather it mattered in the sense that we got greater focus from the international community on the plight of Palestinians, something that extended beyond the actual outcome of two-state solutions. That's why we think we have this debate or any type of discussion about the outcomes for the civil rights of Palestinians in Israel, as opposed to the plight of Assyrians in Lebanon and Syria, which no one obviously cared about. So note the thing about that international support and legitimacy is that it's fixed in rhetorics of colonialism, which are currently on the rise, but that also it stands to an active threat, an active existential threat of the Arab states around Palestine. So now, we thought that what you were going to do if you, what more was most likely to happen if you started negotiating the way to best accede to Israel is that you sever that international support. But the best case scenario for them is that you still are able to capitalize on this international support, which is now apparently declining for no apparent reason at this point. But then that international support, by our analysis, would wither away at the point at which you were beginning your fight for civil rights. So that set them the very high burden of having to establish why those civil rights that you got in that initial negotiation were going to be so great and so perfect, something that we didn't think Israel was ever going to allow to happen. But even if they did on like a judicial legal, like this, the text literally says all citizens are equal, was not going to be reflected in the way things actually played out. So they give you some other reasons as to why it was more like important that you acted now as well. They gave you COVID and they were like, oh, COVID's an existential threat. I thought COVID probably hampered Palestine more than Israel, given Israel's a wealthy country and Palestine is like the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated patches of land on the earth, and then mostly like uncollected, difficult to incorporate and govern collection of citizens in various settlements across the West Bank. So it was more likely that they had less power now. So at the very minimum, by their own analysis, you should at least wait a little bit before trying to capitalize on this. But that also you were going to be able to galvanize the international support of also those Arab states around you, which are more likely to be dealing with it more difficultly than Israel as well, at the point at which you waited for that pandemic to end, as a very minimum against their case speaker. But also, so at that point as well, they had to prove that this decline in animosity between Arab states and Israel was so quick that it was going to actually outpace the effects of COVID if we were to wait for that to naturally play out. But like, I didn't really see any reason that would be the case, given the analysis that Takwa gave you and the extensions I've given you on that, on why that animosity exists in the first place and the existential threat of disenfranchisement that those people face. Also, like just the way the Arab League interfaces with Israel and Palestine. Okay, now finally on rights, can you get them and who gets them back? So they say that oh, you're gonna have Israel provide rights, and they give you a few reasons for this. The very first two clear points they gave were Israel is not evil and Israel has nothing to lose. Now, see, the only response you need to give against that is Israel has something to lose. The response at second as to why our incentives of Israel didn't work were, oh, you didn't explain it, or obviously they want to control the land because you can bomb Jerusalem from it. Look, we gave you, that's the beauty of the trilemma that Israel faces. Because yes, it was true they wanted the land, but it was also intuitively true that they wanted a majority Jewish electoral base because that was how they maintained the current path trajectory of that state. The moment you had more Arabs in the state, it was unclear why they wouldn't be able to vote for a party which would, give some sovereignty or internal autonomy to Palestine, even after the point at which you've acceded to Israel, which is obviously not something which those currently in power or any of those parties, however progressive, want. So at that point, that was another vital concern to them. And we also thought that, based on both teams' analysis, that they cared about being a democracy. So you can't have all three of those things when you say that you have to have control of that territory. We think that means either Israel fails to be a democracy, or alternatively, you will actively try to disenfranchise the Arab citizens within their borders. And that active disenfranchisement is now going to be a lot worse because it is severer and it is more ongoing, and it is severed from any of the international support that, if a two-state solution was never reached and you ended up incorporating anyway, would have continued and heightened the advocacy for those types of rights into the future. Note as well, we gave you a few more structural pieces of analysis at Takwa, which were ignored as to why those rights were unlikely to happen. Things like the current institutional imbalance of power within the Palestinian state, how that was likely to be perpetuated. But note, if their final push here was like, oh, we're going to get more progressive politics, we didn't think that mattered if those progressive politics were still going to be ones which were primarily ethnically Jewish over Arab. They needed to show why Israel would be fine fundamentally changing the character of its state. That was a huge incentive that we gave you. Because of this, very proud to oppose.
Thank you to the second negative speaker for that speech. I'd now like to invite the third affirmative speaker.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Note how second speaker from negative shirks away from their burden that they don't have to defend that they have to propose a two-state argument, and at the same vein say that it's very likely for the two-state argument to exist when they say things like Joe Biden supports the idea of a two-state solution. Palestine necessarily will be better off with the two-state solution, but at the same time don't tell us any benefits of how civil rights are going to be protected under a two-state solution if they are proposing that idea. So I think the argument on a trump card from their end is significantly harmed because they don't provide the mechanization of how civil rights is going to be better off in their world. But we'll be generous to them, right? We'll disprove a few of their simple, basic argument on how the trilemma that they have and how we'll work on that trilemma of problems that Israel has. One, with regard to the majority Jewish vote bank, right? This is something which we think is specifically problematic in their own case, because they argue that if there is a large Arab majority that comes into your state and now you have to give them citizenship and voting rights, that also means you have significant amount of control and power over these individuals because you're guaranteeing them these rights. And the kind of groups which will necessarily provide them these rights, i.e. the center left and the centrists of Israel, who aren't Netanyahu, and the fact that these individuals currently only agree on the fact that self-preservation is the only reason why they both align together. We think a large chunk of the center left and the centrists and the center left would be aligned to take up this vote bank, which means it's important for them to use them as vote banks, like how we use how in India Dalits are used, or oppressed minorities are used. We're okay with the fact that these individuals are going to probably have worse lives, significantly bad lives in comparison to a world where they have significantly worse lives and at the same time have a threat of being bombed and dying, right? Because they hold on to the trump card of statehood throughout a large extent. Because if that's the problem and they say that the idea of a majority Jewish state isn't going to be maintained. It's going to be maintained, and it's going to continue to be maintained like that of the Kurds, like that of the Kashmirs, like that of the Kashmiris in India, right? We think a large chunk of these particular cases can continue to exist, and these perpetuations will not stop. Secondly, with regard to our worst case, right? They said, like, listen, like Palestine, like the idea that like international support, like they need to be seen as a legitimate democracy and like respect international law and all of that, right? Like that's really weird to argue, because like Israel has continuously like worked against ceasefire violations, has continuously caused ceasefire violations, has continuously like worked against like reprimands of the UN, because a large chunk of like history shows that the United States will never veto against them. And even if they say that Joe Biden is somehow going to work on this, this is significantly problematic, because the existing Jewish lobby in America is so strong that they will never be able to vote against a specific like organization like Netanyahu's government, which will continue to perpetuate. Even if it's not Netanyahu, it'll probably be someone who still wants to have self-preservation of Israel as the most important mandate in terms of this particular case, and therefore will not support Joe Biden in terms of like on the international stage in terms of having any sort of like mechanism to vote for like Palestine being a state, which is kind of untrue for them to say like Palestine is a state. Palestine is a non-member observer state of the United Nations and has no voting power. And therefore, a large chunk of this power that exists with the United States will now continue to perpetuate. And the long-term ramifications that continue to exist is going to be worse off. Thirdly, in terms of the idea of COVID, they said like COVID is such a minuscule problem right now, and they even analyze it for us, right? Which is kind of thankful. We're kind of thankful for them, because if they're saying that like Palestine is significantly weaker right now and Israel is significantly stronger, the card of statehood makes them even more vulnerable, because the fact that now if they are bombed, they're bombed by two things, i.e., COVID as well as bombs from Israel. If that means a large chunk of people are going to die as with disease without any sort of medical facilities or civil rights that can be guaranteed, if they now move into the Israeli state, it's more likely for them to have safe havens, even if they're ghettoized, even if they're probably going to die in like because of COVID, but they're still not going to die of bombings, right? We think this self-preservation actually benefits a large chunk of the Palestinians in a world where they're still going to be worse off. We still think they're worse off. They're better off in a comparative world. In terms of our arguments, right? We told you that the idea of international support is waning significantly. Let's look at the argument that they ran with regard to Yemen, right? The reason why Israel rammed into Yemen right now is primarily because the fact that they believe that funding for Hamas and like other terrorist organizations against Palestine comes from Yemen and other states like that, right? Which means a large chunk of their like defense mechanism, large chunk of their attacks on other states or anything of that sort has largely been defensive. Their second argument, and this beats the argument that like, yeah, Israel does a lot of things to like attack other states. It doesn't, and largely because the fact that Israel has no incentive to do so. Secondly, we also think that the argument with regard to international support waning, wherein like they say Arab states have an incentive to work within have to work for Palestine because of a colonial idea. We think that's specifically wrong, because like if they were so like against colonialism, they would obviously go into like places like Yemen, Lebanon, etc. Like they would obviously like go against things like how like Iraq invaded Kuwait or other things like currently exist. This sort of colonialism argument that exists with regard to like Kuwait, etc. still exists. Palestine isn't something which is unique. The only identity that binds them is the Arab identity that continuously exists among the Arab League nations, and the Arab League nations are significantly weakened. We proved to you 4 things with regard to Middle Eastern support. One, we proved to you that a large chunk of the oil money that comes from like Middle Eastern states, even if it isn't going to move away from Israel if this move of like having statehood moves away, because even now they have to, now that there are Arab populations in that country and there's an Arab population which needs resources, they probably will be more benevolent towards like giving resources. But even if that's not the case, America continues to exist as an ally where they continue to provide oil to these countries and have a significant amount of clout in those particular states. Thirdly, it's very important to also analyze that a large chunk of this entire idea of like colonization is based on the presumption that like that Palestine is now a colony of like Israel, and not based on the fact that Israel is claiming actual legitimate like claims of this particular area. We think that a long shot for statehood as a trump card is going to be that at a point where Israel is going to be weak in the future, at a point where Israel will not have a pro-Zionist like government like Netanyahu, it's going to be likely for them to claim statehood as a possible way to get civil rights. We're saying The trump card in and of itself is a stumbling block to have any sort of discussion to the negotiating table. The moment the trump card is being used from their end, there's absolutely no way that there's going to be any sort of legitimate discussion with regard to this two-state dialogue or anything of that sort, right? This is of statehood in general, right? Lastly, their argumentation on like how there is no other support with regard to this, we think that the international community, especially America, considering they declared like Jerusalem as the official US embassy, already delegitimized Palestine's existence and Palestine's claims to the areas around Israel. We think a large chunk of like the arguments that comes from their end with regard to cultural harms that exist will still exist in their world. Our world, at least those cultural harms will be faced within a ghettoized community within those areas. We're okay with that. Our worst case is that our world will still have Palestinians in worse off conditions, but they're not going to be bombed. In your case, they're continuously going to be bombed. There is no international support or threshold to benefit this. There is no ability for other states to rally around this. There is no way that Israel is going to give up these kind of claims. We're extremely proud to oppose in this debate.
Them rights that will never like get them to a point of comparative power because they are no longer a threat in any way. Whereas at least in our world, if they want to like shoot down the worst claims of statehood or statehood and all of the analysis they give you on why they would want to do that, we think you're more likely to give like more rights to Palestinian Israeli citizens because like on those conditions, but you definitely should not give up your biggest bargaining chip in exchange for beginning a campaign for rights. That was clearly not good. The last point under civil rights is what we told you on if rights fail and if Israel fails to actually provide these rights once you've given it up. We said that like giving you examples of groups like the Assyrians, an ethnic minority that is, or like an ethnic group within a state that is oppressed is going to get significantly less international attention once there isn't a sovereignty claim because this domesticizes the issue. In our world, it at least stays in international attention because even if in our worst case scenario where Jewish expansion continues and like all of the West Bank is overtaken, we think that at least then the Palestinian population is able to like use the signaling effect of like they have colonized us, you really need to look after our human rights international community as compared to like giving the optics of consent. Next thing I'm going to touch on is briefly on statehood. Note that as much as they tried to burden push it to us, we didn't actually have to prove that we got statehood, but we might. So here's the potential, because they actually give you very little reason to believe that that is true. They tell you that Israel's allies are unreliable. Firstly, most of their analysis on first year was about like COVID, but also we think that they are comparatively less likely to support the Palestinians and look after the Palestinians when they're suffering human rights abuses if the Palestinians are seen as ceding to their enemy. Then a like better analysis was probably that like, the US makes this impossible. I think that James has already established to you that like the US has historically and likely will continue to support elements of two-state solution. That obviously doesn't mean that we guaranteedly get the two-state solution, but it is something that like if there is a possibility of us getting it, we think that this is more reason not to abandon it because we think that like your rights when you are not being controlled by a group that like has entire existence is kind of based on your oppression are going to be significantly more secured. So the potential of getting that is super important. We also told you that there was probably some principled reason that you shouldn't have to cede to colonialism just because you thought that that was the only way that you could preserve your rights. So at the end of this point, even if we don't get statehood, we definitely do get at least as good civil rights. So any potential of us getting statehood like is still worth not abandoning this for because they haven't actually proven an active harm to us continuing to fight for statehood. Actually, they tried. They gave us one, and it's what I'm going to end this speech on, which is on regional instability. Their first thing is like lots of analysis about bombing. This obviously implies that de-escalation within the region happens. Firstly, they've given us no reason to believe that like all Palestinians are okay with this, so that like there isn't continued conflict and they aren't continued bombings. Secondly, I don't think they have fiat to make everyone in Palestine stop. Secondly, they're like, the hatred towards Israel from the Arab world will stop. So that's good. I don't think that hatred was ever actually directly about the Palestinians, more so as seeing an illegitimate entity in their eyes in that state. Israel, if anything, is only more powerful. I think that is more likely to like inflame tensions there. So I didn't get how they actively de-escalated it. At the end of this speech, note that like they actually gave you very few reasons to discuss how having statehood as a goal made it harder to get civil rights. We told you we made it easier. We told you the potential of a state made it definitely worth it, even if that was a wash. And their material and instability didn't stand. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you to the third negative speaker. I now invite the negative reply speaker.
I've just been experiencing some connection difficulties during the last two speeches. So if at any point I'm inaudible or you need me to repeat stuff, please let me know. I can try to change to a different connection.
Yep, no problem.
The metric for adjudication in this debate was who gets a better world, and that mainly boiled down to a single question of can you get rights, and if you can, how? Now, we gave you a few persuasive pieces of analysis